Rose Bennett's day began the same way it had for the past 5 years, in darkness, in cold, and in silence. The servants' quarters at Ashworth House offered little comfort beyond a narrow bed and a wooden chest for her few possessions. At 4:30 in the morning, when the rest of London still slept, Rose was already awake, already moving, already beginning the endless cycle of labour that defined her existence as a scullery maid in one of the city's grandest houses. She was 24 years old, and she'd been invisible for most of her life. The work was backbreaking and relentless, hauling coal from the cellar to feed the kitchen fires, scrubbing pots blackened from the previous day's cooking until her hands were raw and bleeding, washing floors on her hands and knees until the marble gleamed like glass, emptying chamber pots and carrying endless buckets of water up and down the servants' stairs. By the time the family and the upper servants sat down to breakfast in rooms warmed by fires Rose had built, she had already worked for 4 hours straight. For this, she earned £12 per year. Of that, she sent £10 home to her mother in the London slums where Rose had been born and raised. Mrs. Elizabeth Bennett was a widow trying to support herself and Rose's younger brother Thomas on the pittance she earned taking in laundry. Thomas was 16 now, apprenticed to a carpenter, and the apprenticeship fee had come from Rose's savings. Every shilling Rose sent home meant her mother could eat that week, meant Thomas could continue learning his trade, meant the family might someday escape the crushing poverty that had already claimed Rose's father to a factory accident when she was 12. Rose kept £2 for herself each year, carefully hoarded pennies and shillings hidden in a small tin box under her bed. She had been saving for something specific, though the goal seemed so distant it was almost laughable. She wanted to open a bakery, just a small shop, nothing grand, somewhere she could practice the one skill that brought her genuine joy, baking. On her rare half-days off, Rose would slip into the vast Ashworth House kitchen after the cook had retired and practice making the pastries her grandmother had taught her as a child. Apple tarts with cinnamon and brown sugar, soft white rolls that melted on the tongue, cherry scones studded with dried fruit. She would share these creations with the other servants, who praised her work and told her she had a gift. But at her current rate of saving, it would take more than 20 years to accumulate enough capital to open even the humblest shop. Rose would be nearly 50 by then, her youth and strength spent scrubbing other people's floors. Still, she allowed herself to dream during those quiet moments in the kitchen, her hands working dough while her mind constructed elaborate fantasies of a future that would probably never arrive. The Duke of Ashworth was a man Rose saw every single day and who had never once looked at her directly. William Ashworth was 40 years old, tall and distinguished with dark hair just beginning to silver at the temples. He had inherited his title at 25 when his father died suddenly of heart failure, and he had spent the subsequent 15 years managing the vast Ashworth estates and the family's shipping empire with ruthless efficiency. He sat in the House of Lords. He served on the boards of multiple companies. He moved through society with the easy confidence of a man who had never questioned his right to command every room he entered. To William, servants were part of the house machinery, no more worthy of individual attention than the gaslight fixtures or the mahogany furniture. Rose had worked in his London residence for 5 years, and he had never asked her name. She knew this because Mrs. Morrison, the housekeeper, had mentioned it once with a sort of resigned sadness. "His Grace doesn't concern himself with the lower servants," Mrs. Morrison had said. "Nothing personal, dear. That's just how it is with the aristocracy. We're invisible to them unless something goes wrong." Rose had long since accepted her invisibility. It was simply the nature of her position in the world. She was nobody, nothing, a pair of hands that scrubbed and hauled and cleaned without ever being attached to a person who mattered. The other servants knew her, of course. Annie Cooper, the housemaid who shared her quarters, had become her dearest friend. They would whisper together late at night about their dreams and fears, about the lives they wished they could live, instead of the ones they were born into. But to the family upstairs, to the Duke who walked past her in hallways without seeing her, Rose might as well have been a ghost. William's life, from Rose's observations gathered over years of silent service, was one of extraordinary privilege and extraordinary emptiness. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret Ashworth, was a formidable woman of 65 who ruled London society with an iron will and rigid adherence to propriety. She lived in the family's country estate in Kent, but visited London regularly to oversee her son's household and, more pressingly, to pressure him about marriage. Rose had overheard countless such conversations while cleaning the hallways outside the drawing room. "You're 40 years old, William," the Dowager Duchess would say, with the kind of exasperation that suggested this was a well-worn argument. "You must marry and produce an heir. The Ashworth line cannot end with you." "I'll marry when I find someone suitable," William would reply with the patience of a man who had given this answer 1,000 times. "You've met every suitable woman in England," his mother would snap back. "The problem is that you find fault with all of them. Too frivolous, too serious, too obsessed with fashion, too bookish. William, you must be reasonable." "I must be reasonable, mother, or I must be obedient." The conversations would continue in this vein until one of them left the room in frustration. Rose, scrubbing the marble floor outside, would feel an unexpected sympathy for the Duke. He was trapped in his own way, she supposed, trapped by expectations and duty and the weight of a title he had never chosen. At least Rose's chains were visible. His were gilded and called privileged, but they constrained him nonetheless. What Rose didn't know, what William himself barely acknowledged, was that he harboured his own secret dream. In his private study, hidden among the ledgers and business documents that consumed his official life, were worn volumes of classical philosophy and ancient history. His grandfather had been a Cambridge don, a scholar of Greek and Latin who had only reluctantly been pulled into the family business by William's father. William's grandfather had been the happiest person William had ever known, and William sometimes wondered what his life might have been like if he had been permitted to follow that scholarly path instead of inheriting a dukedom at 25. He imagined teaching at a university, shaping young minds, discussing Plato and Aristotle with eager students, creating something meaningful rather than simply maintaining an empire built by previous generations. But such fantasies were indulgent and pointless. He was the Duke of Ashworth. His duty was clear. His path was set. There was no room for personal desire when generations of family legacy rested on his shoulders. The dress had taken Rose 2 full years to afford. She had saved every spare penny with obsessive care, hiding shillings in her tin box and counting them weekly like a miser with his treasure. When she finally had enough to purchase the fabric, she and Annie had walked to the market on their half-day off and selected a bolt of pale blue cotton. It wasn't silk or fine wool like the ladies upstairs wore. It was simple, cheap cotton, but it was new and clean and a colour that Annie insisted brought out the green in Rose's hazel eyes. For weeks, Rose and Annie had worked on the dress during their few precious hours of free time. Annie was better with a needle than Rose, and she had carefully constructed a day dress in a modest style that wouldn't be too obviously shabby compared to what respectable women wore. When it was finally complete, Rose had looked at herself in the small cracked mirror in their quarters and felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Hope. "You look like a lady," Annie had whispered with genuine admiration. "I look like a scullery maid in a new dress," Rose had corrected, but she smiled despite herself. The gloves were borrowed from Annie, kid leather that had been mended at the seams more than once but were still the nicest gloves either of them owned. Rose had no hat, couldn't afford one, but Annie had styled her dark brown hair in a simple arrangement that looked almost fashionable. Standing in that cramped servants' quarters with her best dress and borrowed gloves, Rose had allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, that she was someone who mattered, someone who could walk through Hyde Park on a Sunday afternoon and belong there, even briefly, among the respectable people who took their leisure in the spring sunshine. "Are you certain about this?" Annie had asked with worry creasing her forehead. "You know how cruel they can be if they realise you're not one of them." "I just want one afternoon," Rose had said quietly. "Just a few hours to feel normal, to walk in the park like regular people do. Is that so much to ask?" Annie had hugged her fiercely. "No, love. It's not too much. You deserve a bit of happiness. Just be careful. Sunday, the 14th of April, 1885, dawned clear and bright. One of those perfect spring days that made London almost beautiful, despite the coal smoke and the crowds. Rose had the afternoon free, a rare gift from Mrs. Morrison, who had taken pity on her after Rose had worked 3 consecutive days without rest to cover for a sick housemaid. She put on her precious new dress with hands that trembled slightly, pulled on Annie's gloves, and walked the 1.5 miles to Hyde Park, with her head high and her heart hammering with nervous anticipation. The park was magnificent in spring, all fresh green grass and flowering trees, and well-dressed people strolling the wide paths in the warm afternoon sun. Ladies twirled parasols and showed off elaborate gowns of silk and satin in every colour imaginable. Gentlemen in fine coats and top hats escorted them with the easy confidence of people who had never once worried about where their next meal would come from. Children in expensive clothes played under the watchful eyes of nannies. It was a world Rose had only ever glimpsed from the outside, and walking into it felt like stepping onto a stage where she didn't know her lines. She was acutely aware of every inadequacy. Her dress was cotton when everyone else wore silk. Her gloves were mended when theirs were pristine. She had no jewellery, no parasol, no hat, no gentleman escort. Other women glanced at her, and she could see them cataloguing these deficiencies, and could see the subtle dismissal in their eyes. She was tolerated, but not welcomed, present, but not included. Still, Rose walked. She held her head up and walked the paths and tried to absorb every detail of this world she would probably never enter again. She watched the family feeding ducks at the Serpentine. She admired the spring flowers blooming in carefully tended beds. She breathed air that wasn't thick with coal smoke from kitchen fires and let the sun warm her face. For 30 minutes, she was almost happy. Then Lord Gerald Hastings noticed her. He was 32 years old, wealthy, handsome in a cold sort of way, and utterly without conscience. Rose didn't know this yet. All she saw was a well-dressed gentleman with light brown hair and blue eyes approaching her with a smile that seemed kind. He tipped his hat. He introduced himself. He asked if she was enjoying the lovely weather. And Rose, who had never had a gentleman speak to her as if she were a person of consequence, felt a dangerous flutter of hope in her chest. "May I walk with you?" Lord Hastings asked with practised charm. "It seems a shame for such a lovely young lady to be enjoying the park alone." Rose should have said no, should have recognised something predatory in him, something calculating in his smile. But she was 24 years old, and no one had ever called her a lovely young lady before. No one had ever looked at her the way Lord Hastings was looking at her now, as if she were someone worth noticing. Yes, thank you, my lord," she managed, and he offered his arm. They walked together for perhaps half an hour, and it was the most magical 30 minutes of Rose's life. Lord Hastings told her about his travels to Italy. He complimented her eyes and her smile. He asked her opinions about art and literature, as if her answers actually mattered to him. Rose carefully avoided any direct lies, but also didn't volunteer information about her true position. When he asked what she did, she said vaguely that she worked in a household, which could mean anything from governess to lady's companion. Lord Hastings seemed to assume she was genteel but impoverished, which was close enough to the truth that Rose didn't correct him. She was drunk on the attention, on the feeling of mattering to someone, even if that someone was a stranger who would forget her by tomorrow. She let herself pretend that this was her real life, that she was the kind of woman who walked in Hyde Park on Sunday afternoons with gentlemen who found her interesting. The fantasy was so sweet and so fragile and so doomed. The shattering came suddenly and with brutal efficiency. They had just passed a flower bed, brilliant with tulips, when Rose saw Mrs. Morrison, the Ashworth House housekeeper, walking toward them with another upper servant. Mrs. Morrison's eyes widened with shock when she recognised Rose. She looked from Rose to Lord Hastings and back to Rose, and Rose saw the exact moment Mrs. Morrison understood what was happening. The older woman's face flooded with pity and concern. Lord Hastings noticed the exchange. He was observant in the way predators are observant, always alert to weakness. always watching for advantage. "Do you know that woman?" he asked Rose, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. Rose's throat went dry. She could lie. She could claim not to know Mrs. Morrison. But what would be the point? The truth would come out eventually, and lying would only make the humiliation worse. "Yes, my lord," she said quietly. "I work with her." "Work with her," Lord Hastings repeated slowly, his smile cooling several degrees. "In what capacity?" "We're both in service, my lord, at Ashworth House." The change in Lord Hastings was instantaneous and complete. The warm charm vanished as if it had never existed, replaced by cold contempt that hit Rose like a physical blow. He stepped away from her as if she had suddenly become diseased, his lip curling with disgust. "In service," he said loudly enough that people nearby turned to look. "And what precisely is your position in service, Miss—" He made her lack of surname sound like an accusation. "I'm a scullery maid, my lord." Rose's voice was barely above a whisper, but the words carried in the sudden silence that had fallen around them. Lord Hastings laughed, a harsh sound devoid of any humour. "A scullery maid? Good God! You presented yourself as a woman of quality when you're nothing but a kitchen drudge." "I never said—" Rose tried to protest, but he cut her off. "Look at you." His voice was getting louder, attracting more attention, more stares. "Wearing gloves you obviously borrowed, in a dress made from the cheapest cotton available, pretending to be something you're not. Have you no shame?" People were gathering now, drawn by the spectacle. Rose felt their eyes on her like knives, cutting, judging, finding her unworthy. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She wanted to defend herself, but her voice had abandoned her. Lord Hastings was warming to his theme now, enjoying his audience. He pointed to Rose's gloves with theatrical disdain. "Mended at the seams. Borrowed finery because you can't afford your own. And I suppose you have no dowry, no family of any consequence. Nothing to offer except the dubious charm of a woman who doesn't know her proper place." Each word landed like a stone. Rose felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of these people who were drinking in her humiliation like fine wine. "The promenade is for your betters, girl," Lord Hastings said with finality, his voice dripping with condescension. "I suggest you return to the kitchen where you belong, and next time you get ideas above your station, remember this moment. Remember that you are nothing and will always be nothing." He turned on his heel and walked away, already laughing with his friends who had joined him, no doubt regaling them with the amusing story of the scullery maid who had dared to pretend she was a lady. The crowd around Rose dispersed slowly, whispers following them like the wake of a ship. Rose stood frozen in place, her borrowed gloves clutched in hands that shook with humiliation and rage and devastating hurt. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable. Rose turned and fled blindly through the park, not seeing where she was going, just needing to escape the stares and whispers and the crushing weight of her own worthlessness. She ran until her cheap shoes rubbed blisters on her heels, ran until her lungs burned, ran until she found herself in a secluded grove near a small pond where the trees offered shelter from prying eyes. She collapsed onto a weathered wooden bench and let the sobs come, great racking sounds that seemed to tear themselves from somewhere deep in her chest. The gloves fell from her hands into her lap, and looking at them now felt like mockery. What had she been thinking? That wearing borrowed gloves and a homemade dress would somehow transform her into someone who mattered? That a gentleman would see past her poverty and station to the person underneath? She had been a fool. The cruelest kind of fool. The kind who believed that wanting something badly enough could make it possible. "I'll never be anything but what I am," she whispered to the uncaring trees. "Nobody. Nothing. A pair of hands that scrub floors until they bleed." Rose had no way of knowing that across the park, in an entirely different section of the promenade, William Ashworth, Duke of Ashworth, had witnessed the entire catastrophic scene. William had not intended to be in Hyde Park that afternoon. He had spent the morning at his gentleman's club, attempting to tolerate a business meeting with several associates, including Lord Gerald Hastings. The meeting had ended earlier than expected, when one of the other men was called away on urgent business, and William had found himself with the rare gift of an unexpected free afternoon. Rather than return immediately to his empty house, he had decided to walk through the park, thinking he might clear his head, and perhaps stop by a bookshop on his way home to search for a new translation of Marcus Aurelius he'd been wanting. He had been thinking about Stoic philosophy and the nature of duty when he caught sight of a familiar figure some distance ahead. It took him a moment to place her because the context was so wrong. Servants belonged in his house, not walking freely through Hyde Park in the spring sunshine, but there was no mistaking her once his brain made the connection. It was Rose, his scullery maid, wearing a dress he'd never seen before and walking with... Was that Gerald Hastings? William stopped in his tracks, confused and oddly unsettled. What was his scullery maid doing walking with Hastings in Hyde Park? And why did she look so different? The dress was simple, obviously inexpensive, but it fit her well and the colour suited her. Her hair was arranged simply but becomingly, and when Hastings said something that made her smile, William felt something strange twist in his chest. He had never seen her smile before, had never really looked at her at all, if he was being honest. In 5 years, she had been nothing but a vague presence in his peripheral vision, a servant who performed tasks he never thought about. But seeing her now, in this unexpected context, William truly looked at her for the first time. She was lovely, not beautiful in the conventional sense that society prized, but there was something appealing about her features, something genuine in her expression. She looked happy walking with Hastings, and William felt an irrational surge of irritation. What business did Hastings have walking with his servant? And more pressingly, why did William care? He was too far away to hear the conversation, but close enough to see when everything changed. He saw another woman approach and exchange looks with Rose. He saw Hastings's body language shift from charm to contempt, and then he heard Hastings' voice rising, carrying across the park with the kind of projection that indicated a man playing to an audience. "A scullery maid!" The words hit William like cold water. He watched the scene unfold with growing horror and fury, watched Hastings publicly shame Rose for the crime of being poor, watched the crowd gather to witness her humiliation, watched her stand there, taking abuse she had done nothing to deserve. And when Hastings delivered his final cruelty about her being nothing, and always being nothing, William felt rage course through him with an intensity that surprised him. He had known Gerald Hastings for years, had done business with him, had tolerated his presence at clubs and social events, but William had never truly seen the man's cruelty on such a clear display, and the sight of it made him want to cross the park and plant his fist in Hastings' aristocratic face. He didn't do that. Social convention and years of trained restraint held him in place. But when he saw Rose flee, when he saw her stumbling through the park, with tears streaming down her face, something inside William broke free of those constraints. He followed her at a distance, tracking her path through the trees, until she collapsed on a bench in a secluded grove, and began to sob with the kind of heartbreak that sounded like it might never end. William stood hidden in the trees, watching her cry, and felt ashamed in a way he had never experienced before. This woman had worked in his house for 5 years, 5 years during which he had walked past her countless times without seeing her, without knowing her name, without acknowledging her humanity. And now she sat on a bench weeping because someone had treated her exactly the way William himself had been treating her all along, as if she were nobody, nothing, beneath notice. The realization was devastating in its simplicity. He was no better than Hastings. Worse, perhaps, because Hastings's cruelty was at least honest and direct. William's had been the cruelty of indifference, of never bothering to see a person who had been right in front of him for years. He made a decision then that would change both their lives irrevocably. He stepped out from the trees and walked toward the bench where Rose sat hunched over her grief, her shoulders shaking with sobs she tried to muffle behind her hands. "Miss Bennett," he said gently. Rose's head snapped up, and William saw her face transform through a rapid succession of emotions: shock, horror, humiliation. She scrambled to her feet, trying to curtsy despite her distress, nearly losing her balance in the process. "Your Grace!" Her voice was broken and hoarse from crying. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know you were here. I'll leave immediately." "Please don't," William interrupted, and the gentleness in his own voice surprised him. "Don't leave, and don't apologize. You've done nothing wrong." Rose stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "I don't understand. I shouldn't be here. I should be at the house." You should be wherever you wish to be on your afternoon off," William said firmly. "And right now, I'm asking you to sit down. Please." Slowly, uncertain, Rose lowered herself back onto the bench. William sat beside her, a shocking breach of social protocol that made Rose's eyes widen with confusion. They sat there for a moment in silence, William trying to find words for something he didn't fully understand himself. "I saw what happened," he said finally, "with Lord Hastings. I saw the whole thing." Rose's face flooded with fresh shame. "Of all the people to witness that," she whispered. "Why did it have to be you?" "Because I needed to see it," William said quietly, "though I'm not certain I can explain why yet." He looked at her properly then, really looked, in a way he had never looked at her before. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but they were remarkable eyes, a warm hazel colour that seemed to hold both strength and vulnerability. Her face was pale with distress, but he could see intelligence there, dignity despite her circumstances, a quality of presence that had nothing to do with wealth or status. The dress she wore had been made with obvious care, every stitch careful and precise, transforming cheap fabric into something almost lovely through sheer force of effort and hope. "Those gloves," William said, gesturing to where they lay in her lap. "They're borrowed," Rose nodded miserably. "From Annie, the housemaid. They're the nicest gloves either of us owns. And the dress? I made it myself. It took 2 years to save for the fabric." Her voice broke. 2 years, and Lord Hastings destroyed it all in 5 minutes. "No," William said firmly. "He didn't destroy anything. He revealed himself to be a man of limited character and no compassion. But he didn't diminish you. That's not within his power." Rose looked at him with something like wonder. "Why are you being kind to me? You're my employer. You're not just anything," William interrupted. "And that's exactly the problem. That's what I'm beginning to understand. For 5 years, you've worked in my house, and I've never once asked your name. I've walked past you hundreds of times without seeing you, without recognizing that you're a person with thoughts and feelings and dreams as valid as my own. And today, watching what Hastings did to you, I realized something shameful about myself." He paused, gathering courage to speak a truth he'd been avoiding. "I've been treating you the same way he did, with invisibility instead of cruelty. But the result is the same. You've been no one to me, and I'm sorry for that. I'm deeply sorry." Tears started sliding down Rose's cheeks again, but these were different tears. "No one has ever apologized to me," she said wonderingly. "Not in my entire life. No one is important enough that their apology would mean anything." "Then I'm doubly sorry," William said, "because you deserved many apologies long before mine." They sat in companionable silence for several minutes. A breeze rustled the leaves overhead and carried the scent of spring flowers. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the park, children laughing, horses clopping along the carriage path, the murmur of conversation. But in their secluded grove, it felt as if they existed in a bubble removed from all of that, a space where the normal rules didn't quite apply. "Tell me about yourself," William said eventually. "Please. I'd like to know." Rose hesitated, then something in his face seemed to convince her of his sincerity. She told him about her childhood in London's East End, about her father who had worked in a factory making matches until the phosphorus poisoning claimed his lungs and his life. She described her mother taking in endless loads of laundry, her hands raw and bleeding from the harsh soap, trying to keep food on the table for Rose and her younger brother Thomas. She explained how she'd entered service at 14, starting as the lowest kitchen girl and working her way up to scullery maid over the past decade. "It's not much of a promotion," Rose said, with bitter humour. "Still the lowest position in your household, still invisible to everyone who matters. "You're not invisible to me," William said. "Not anymore. And you matter very much." Rose looked at him searchingly. Why? What changed in the span of an afternoon? "I finally opened my eyes," William said simply, "and saw what had been there all along." He asked about her dreams, and Rose found herself telling him about the bakery, about her secret passion for baking, the hours she spent in his kitchen on her rare free time, making pastries that she shared with the other servants. She described her fantasy of one day opening a tiny shop. Nothing grand, just a neighborhood place where people could find fresh bread and honest cakes made with care. "It would take me another 20 years to save enough," she admitted. "By then I'll be too old and too tired to manage it. But I like thinking about it anyway. It gives me something to work toward, even if I never get there." "You will get there," William said with quiet conviction. "I don't know how yet, but you will. People with that much passion and determination don't fail. They just need the right opportunity." Rose smiled at that, a real smile that transformed her whole face. William felt his breath catch. She was beautiful when she smiled, and he had never noticed it before because he had never bothered to look. "What about you?" Rose asked, surprising him with her directness. "What do you dream about, Your Grace? Beyond business and estates and all the responsibilities of being a duke?" It was a question no one had ever asked him. People asked about his companies, his investments, his political positions, but no one asked about his dreams, as if it were understood that men like him didn't have personal desires beyond accumulating more power and wealth. "I think I'd want to teach," William said slowly, the words feeling dangerous and liberating at the same time. "History or classics, at a university, shaping young minds instead of just managing business ventures I inherited rather than chose. My grandfather was a Cambridge Don. He was the happiest person I ever knew. I think about that sometimes, what it would be like to pursue knowledge instead of just maintaining an empire." "Then why don't you?" Rose asked with the blunt pragmatism of someone who had never had the luxury of making choices. "Because it's not that simple. I have responsibilities, people who depend on the company for their livelihoods, family expectations going back generations. You can't just walk away from all of that because you'd rather read Plato than review shipping manifests. Can't you?" Rose challenged gently. "Or is it that you've never tried because you're afraid of what walking away might cost?" The question hit closer to truth than William wanted to admit. He sat with it, turning it over in his mind while Rose waited patiently beside him. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Soon it would be improper for them to remain together unchaperoned, though that seemed laughable, given how thoroughly they'd already violated every social convention. "I should let you return home," William said reluctantly. "It's getting late, and you'll need to be back at the house." "Yes," Rose agreed, but neither of them moved to stand. "May I see you again?" The words came out before William could stop them, surprising both of them. Not as an employer, an employee, just as William and Rose. "May we speak again like this?" Rose knew she should say no, knew that nothing good could come from blurring the lines between master and servant, knew that this afternoon had been an aberration, a moment outside normal life that couldn't be sustained once reality reasserted itself. But looking at William's face, seeing genuine hope and vulnerability there, she found herself nodding. "Yes," she whispered, "I'd like that." "Tomorrow evening," William said, the words coming faster now as if he feared she might change her mind. "After your duties end, meet me in the library, not as my scullery maid, but as yourself. Can you do that?" "I don't know who I am except a scullery maid," Rose said honestly. "Then we'll find out together," William replied. They parted there in that grove as the last light faded from the sky, Rose walking back toward Ashworth House, while William went in the opposite direction to give them the appearance of separate departures. But something had been set in motion that neither of them fully understood yet, something that would transform both their lives in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. Rose returned to the servants' quarters to find Annie waiting anxiously. She told her friend everything that had happened, from Lord Hastings's cruelty to the Duke's unexpected kindness. Annie's face cycled through horror, sympathy, and finally deep concern. "He wants to meet you in the library," Annie whispered urgently. "Rose, you can't. This will end badly. He's a duke. You're a scullery maid. Even if his intentions are honourable, which I doubt they are, there's no way this ends well for you. I know, Rose said quietly. But Annie, for the first time in my life someone saw me. Really saw me. Not what I do or where I come from, but who I am. Can you understand what that feels like? Annie hugged her fiercely. I understand. I just don't want to see you hurt worse than you were today. I'll be careful, Rose promised, though she wasn't certain it was a promise she could keep. That night, Rose lay awake in her narrow bed, replaying every word of her conversation with the Duke. She thought about his apology, about the way he'd looked at her as if she were someone worth seeing. She thought about the impossibility of what was beginning between them, the vast chasm of class and wealth and power that separated a duke from a scullery maid, and she thought about Lord Hastings's words echoing in her mind. You are nothing and will always be nothing. Or was he right? Was she a fool to believe that one kind conversation in a park could change the fundamental reality of who she was and where she belonged in the world? But then she remembered the way William had said her name, the gentleness in his voice, the genuine interest in his questions. And for better or worse, Rose knew she would go to that library tomorrow evening. She would meet him as he'd asked. She would take this chance to be seen, to be known, even if it ended in heartbreak. Because after years of being invisible, even a moment of being truly seen felt worth any risk. The next evening, long after her official duties ended and the house had settled into silence, Rose made her way through the servants' passages to the library. Her heart pounded with every step. She had changed from her work clothes into her only other dress, a simple grey cotton that was clean but obviously worn. Her hands were red and chapped from a day of scrubbing. She felt acutely aware of every way she didn't belong in this beautiful room full of leather-bound books and expensive furniture. William was already there, standing by the window looking out at the darkened garden. He turned when he heard her enter, and his face lit up with such genuine pleasure at seeing her that Rose felt her anxiety ease slightly. You came, he said, as if there had been genuine doubt. I said I would, Rose replied, hovering near the door, uncertain what to do now that she was here. Please, sit. William gestured to one of the leather chairs. Would you like tea? I can ring for… No, wait, that would defeat the purpose, wouldn't it? I'll make it myself. Rose watched in astonishment as the Duke of Ashworth fumbled with a tea service, clearly having never actually prepared tea in his life. He scolded himself slightly on the kettle and put far too much sugar in her cup, but the sheer novelty of watching him try made Rose smile despite her nerves. I'm terrible at this, William admitted, with self-deprecating humour. I've had people do things for me my entire life. I don't actually know how to do most basic tasks. It's a good thing you're a duke, Rose said, because you'd make a terrible servant. William laughed, and the sound seemed to break whatever remaining ice stood between them. They settled into chairs near the fireplace and began to talk, cautiously at first, then with increasing ease as the evening progressed. Rose told him more about her family, about her mother's pride despite their poverty, about Thomas's dedication to learning his carpentry trade. She described the community she'd grown up in, where people looked out for each other because they understood that solidarity was the only defense against a world that viewed them as disposable. She talked about her baking with a passion that made her face come alive, describing flavors and techniques with the precision of an artist discussing her craft. William shared his own childhood, vastly different but lonely in its own way. He described a house full of servants but empty of affection, parents who viewed him as an heir rather than a son. He talked about the weight of inheriting a dukedom at 25, how he'd felt crushed by responsibilities he'd never wanted, and he spoke of his love for classical philosophy with the same passion Rose brought to discussing pastries, quoting Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus from memory, while his eyes shone with genuine enthusiasm. I keep those books hidden, William admitted, gesturing to a shelf of well-worn. My mother thinks they're a waste of time. She believes my only focus should be managing the estates and finding an appropriate wife to produce heirs. And have you, Rose asked, found an appropriate wife? I've met every supposedly appropriate woman in England, William said with a tired smile. According to my mother, I find fault with all of them. Too shallow, too concerned with fashion, too eager to spend my money, too obvious in their calculations about what marrying a duke would gain them. Perhaps you haven't been looking for something appropriate, Rose suggested quietly. Perhaps you've been looking for real. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. William looked at Rose with an intensity that made her breath catch. Perhaps I have been, he said softly, and perhaps I've finally found it. That first evening set the pattern for what came after. Night after night, once the house had settled and the servants had retired to their quarters, Rose would slip through the passages to the library where William waited. They would talk for hours about everything and nothing, sharing ideas and histories and dreams with an ease that surprised them both. William brought Rose books from his collection, discovering that despite her limited formal education, she was a voracious reader with a sharp, analytical mind. Rose read everything he gave her with hunger, asking questions that challenged his own understanding and made him think about familiar texts in new ways. How did you learn to read? William asked one evening. I imagine you didn't have much schooling. My father taught me, Rose said. He'd had a few years of school before he had to start working. He believed education was the only thing that might lift us out of poverty. So every evening, no matter how tired he was, he'd spend an hour teaching Thomas and me our letters. When he died, I kept teaching myself, borrowed books from lending libraries, read everything I could find. Your father was a wise man, William said. He was a desperate man, Rose corrected gently. He knew the world would try to crush us, and he wanted to give us weapons to fight back with. Knowledge was the only weapon he had to offer. Their conversations ranged across philosophy, politics, literature, and life. Rose challenged William's assumptions about the poor with the authority of someone who had lived that reality. William shared perspectives on power and responsibility that Rose had never considered. They argued and debated, and sometimes sat in comfortable silence reading companionably. One evening, William asked to see her bake. They crept down to the kitchen like conspirators, and Rose showed him how to make her grandmother's apple tart. William was hopeless, getting flour everywhere and cutting the apples into wildly uneven pieces. But his enthusiasm was genuine, and his laughter when things went wrong made Rose's chest feel warm in ways she didn't want to examine too closely. When the tart came out of the oven golden and fragrant, William tasted it with the reverence of someone experiencing revelation. This is extraordinary, he said seriously. Rose, this is art. You have a gift. It's just a tart, Rose protested, but she was glowing with pride. It's never just anything when it's made with this much care and skill, William insisted. You should be running your own bakery, creating these for people who would treasure them. That's a nice dream, Rose said wistfully, but you know it's not realistic. It would take decades to save enough. What if someone invested in you? William asked carefully. Provided the capital for you to open your shop. Rose's face closed immediately. I won't accept charity, especially not from you. It wouldn't be charity, William argued. It would be an investment in talent. You'd pay it back with interest once the business was profitable. No, Rose said firmly. This, she gestured between them. Whatever this is, it can't be about money. The moment you start buying things for me, it changes what we are. I won't be your... She stopped, unable to say the word. My what? William asked softly. What do you think I'm offering? I don't know, Rose admitted. But I know that keeping this separate from money is the only way it stays real. William nodded slowly, respecting her boundary, even as he privately resolved to find some way to help her achieve her dream without making her feel purchased. 6 weeks into their nightly meetings, William acknowledged what had been growing between them since that first evening in the library. He was falling in love with Rose Bennett, not despite her being a scullery maid, but because of who she was as a person, intelligent, passionate, brave, kind, and possessed of a dignity that had nothing to do with wealth or status. Rose, for her part, was terrified by what she felt. She had fallen in love with a duke. The sheer impossibility of it should have been laughable, but instead it was heartbreaking. What future could they possibly have? He was 40 years old, and heir to a vast estate. She was 24 and earned £12 per year scrubbing floors. The gulf between them was unbridgeable. Annie noticed the change in Rose, the way she glowed despite the grueling work, the way she hummed while scrubbing floors, the way she counted hours until evening when she could see William again. "You're in love with him," Annie said one night, her voice heavy with concern. "I know," Rose whispered. "I'm a fool." "What do you think will happen?" Annie asked gently. "Best case scenario. Tell me how this ends well." Rose had no answer, because there was no version of this story where a duke married a scullery maid and they lived happily ever after. That was fairy tale nonsense, not reality. "I should end it," Rose said, "before I get hurt worse than I already will be." "But you won't," Annie observed sadly. "No," Rose agreed. "I won't. Because even if it ends in heartbreak, even if I'm left with nothing, these weeks have been the happiest of my life. I've been seen, Annie, truly seen, and I can't give that up. Not yet." William was grappling with his own realization. He was 40 years old and had never once in his life made a choice based solely on what he wanted rather than what was expected. He had inherited his title. He had maintained his business. He had attended Parliament and served on boards and done everything duty demanded. And he had been profoundly unhappy. Rose had awakened something in him, some part that had been dormant so long he'd forgotten it existed. She made him laugh. She challenged his thinking. She looked at him and saw William, not the Duke of Ashworth, and that distinction mattered more than he could have imagined. He knew what society would say if he pursued her openly. He knew his mother would be horrified. He knew the board of directors would see it as proof he'd lost his mind. He knew that choosing Rose meant choosing scandal and censure and the loss of much that he'd spent his life building. And sitting in his study one evening, reviewing financial reports he no longer cared about, William realized something that changed everything. He didn't care. Not about the scandal, not about society's judgment, not about his mother's horror or the board's disapproval. He cared about Rose. He cared about living authentically instead of according to someone else's script. He cared about being happy for the first time in his 40 years. The question was whether he had the courage to act on that realization. The decision was made for him by circumstance and his own inability to hide what he felt any longer. It was late June, and William's mother was hosting one of her regular charitable events. This time a fundraiser for a women's hospital. The Dowager Duchess expected William to attend and bring an appropriate lady as his companion, which he had been avoiding for weeks. But she'd grown insistent, and William knew he couldn't defer forever. What he did instead shocked even himself. He asked Rose to accompany him. "That's madness," Rose said flatly when he made the invitation during one of their library. "I can't attend as your companion. I'm your servant." "Not during these hours," William argued. "During these hours, you're the woman I'm—" He stopped, suddenly nervous about finishing the sentence. "The woman you're what?" Rose asked, her heart pounding. "The woman I'm in love with," William said simply. "I love you, Rose, and I don't want to hide it anymore." Rose felt tears spring to her eyes. "William, you can't love me. This isn't possible." "Why not? Because you're a scullery maid? Because I'm a duke?" "Those are just words, Rose. They don't define who we actually are to each other." "They define everything," Rose said desperately. "Don't you see? You can love me all you want, but the world won't allow this. Your mother will disown you. Society will destroy us both. You'll lose everything." "I've already lost everything that matters," William said intensely. "I lost it years ago by living a life that wasn't mine. Rose, you've shown me what it means to be truly alive. I'm not giving that up. Not for my mother. Not for society. Not for anyone." He took her hands, holding them gently despite their roughness from endless scrubbing. "Come with me to the opera next week. Let me show the world that I choose you, that you matter to me, that I'm done living by other people's rules." "This will destroy you," Rose whispered. "No," William said firmly. "Hiding what I feel would destroy me. This, being honest about loving you, this might be the first real choice I've ever made." Rose looked at him for a long moment, seeing the certainty in his face, the vulnerability, the hope, and despite every rational objection screaming in her mind, She found herself nodding. All right, I'll come with you. But William, when this goes badly, and it will go badly, promise me you won't regret it. The only thing I'd regret, William said, pulling her close, is not being brave enough to choose you. He kissed her then, and it was the first time they'd crossed that physical line. The kiss was gentle but urgent, full of weeks of restrained feeling finally allowed expression. When they broke apart, both were trembling. I love you, Rose whispered. God help me, I love you too. Then that's all that matters, William said. Everything else we'll face together. The opera was at Covent Garden on a warm evening in late June 1885, and it represented the point of no return for both of them. William had insisted on having a dress made for Rose, overriding her protests by pointing out that she couldn't attend the opera in her servant's clothes or even her homemade day dress. The dressmaker had created something beautiful but understated, emerald green silk, that brought out the colour in Rose's hazel eyes, cut in a simple style that wouldn't be too ostentatious. No elaborate jewels, no excessive ornamentation, just a beautiful dress on a beautiful woman. Rose had stared at herself in the mirror and barely recognised the person looking back. Annie had helped with her hair, arranging it in a soft style that framed her face. She looked like someone who belonged at the opera, and the transformation was both thrilling and terrifying. You're sure about this? Annie asked for perhaps the 10th time. Once you walk in there with him, there's no going back. I'm sure, Rose said, though her hands trembled slightly. Whatever happens after tonight, at least I'll have had this. At least I'll know what it's like to be acknowledged, even briefly. William arrived in his carriage at the appointed time, coming to the servants' entrance as they'd arranged to avoid immediate scandal. When he saw Rose in her new dress, his breath caught audibly. You're beautiful, he said, with such sincerity that Rose felt her eyes fill with tears. I'm terrified, she admitted. So am I, William said. But we're doing this together. The arrival at Covent Garden was everything Rose had feared and more. When William's carriage pulled up and he stepped out, a small crowd gathered as they always did for the Duke of Ashworth. But when he extended his hand and Rose emerged, the gasps were audible. Who is she? Never seen her before. Not from any family I recognise. Look, no jewellery, no family jewels. Who is she? The whispers followed them through the lobby like a wave. Rose felt every eye on her, felt the weight of judgment and curiosity and calculation. She held her head high, her hand on William's arm, trying to channel the dignity she'd learned from a lifetime of enduring things that should have broken her. They made their way to William's box, one of the best in the house, prominently positioned where everyone could see them. The Dowager Duchess was already there, and when she saw Rose, her face went white with shock, then red with fury. William, she hissed, rising from her seat. What is the meaning of this? Who is this person? Mother, may I present Miss Rose Bennett? William said calmly. Rose, this is my mother, the Dowager Duchess, Margaret Ashworth. Rose curtsied with the grace she'd practiced 1,000 times as a servant. Your Grace, it's an honour to meet you. Margaret ignored the greeting entirely. William, a word. Now, in private. Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of Rose, William replied, his voice pleasant but carrying an edge of steel. Very well, Margaret said, her voice rising enough that people in nearby boxes could hear. Since you insist on public humiliation, I'll oblige. This woman is your scullery maid. I recognize her from the house. What possessed you to bring a servant to the opera as if she were a lady? The words carried through the opera house like wildfire. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, all attention focused on the Duke's box. Rose felt her face burn, but refused to lower her eyes. Rose is not here as my servant, William said clearly. She's here as the woman I'm courting, the woman I love. The shocked silence that followed could have swallowed the entire building. Then the whispers erupted like a volcano, excited and vicious and delighted by a fresh scandal. Did he say courting? His scullery maid. He's lost his mind. The scandal. Margaret looked like she might faint. You cannot be serious. William, this is madness. She's nobody. She has no family, no breeding, no fortune. She has more worth in her smallest finger than most of society combined, William interrupted, his voice hard. And I don't care what you or anyone else thinks about my choice. Before Margaret could respond, Lord Hastings appeared at the box entrance, drawn by the commotion. When he saw Rose, recognition and cruel delight crossed his face simultaneously. Your Grace, he said with false courtesy, I see you've brought interesting company this evening. Lord Hastings, William's voice could have frozen flame. If you've come to offer commentary, it's not welcome. I merely wanted to inform you, Hastings said, his voice carrying to the growing audience, that your companion is known to me. I encountered her several weeks ago in Hyde Park, where she was attempting to pass herself off as a lady of quality. When I discovered she was merely a scullery maid, naturally I corrected her presumption. Naturally, William said, with ice dripping from every syllable. Because you're such a fine judge of quality, aren't you, Hastings? Tell me, does your quality include publicly humiliating women for the crime of being poor? Does it include mocking honest labour while you gamble away your own inheritance? Hastings's face went red. How dare you? How dare I? William stood, towering over the other man. How dare you? You treated Rose with contempt because she earns her living through honest work instead of living off family money like a parasite. You judged her worthy of cruelty because she couldn't afford expensive gloves. And now you come here to spread more poison because you can't conceive that a woman's value might have nothing to do with her bank balance. The entire opera house was listening now, the performance forgotten in favour of this far more dramatic scene. She's a scullery maid, Hastings sputtered. She scrubs floors. Yes, William said clearly. And she also reads Greek philosophy. She bakes pastries that are genuine works of art. She sends most of her wages home to support her widowed mother and her brother's education. She has more intelligence, more dignity, and more genuine worth than you or most of this audience will ever possess. He turned to address the crowd directly, his voice carrying through the stunned silence. Rose Bennett was born poor. She works a job most of you wouldn't deign to acknowledge, and I'm courting her with every intention of marrying her. Anyone who finds that objectionable is welcome to share their concerns with me directly. The challenge hung in the air. No one spoke. The silence was absolute. Rose sat frozen, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what William had just done. He had publicly claimed her, had defended her in front of all of London society, had essentially destroyed his own reputation to protect hers. Margaret recovered her voice first. William, you're throwing away everything, the family reputation, the business, everything your father built. For what? For her. Yes, William said simply, for her, and for myself, for the chance to live honestly instead of according to your script. I'm done, Mother. Done being who you want me to be, instead of who I am. He offered his hand to Rose. Shall we leave? I think we've provided enough entertainment for one evening. Rose took his hand with fingers that trembled, and together they walked out of that opera house with their heads high, while whispers and stares followed like waves in their wake. The carriage ride back was conducted in silence. When they reached Ashworth House, William helped Rose down, and they stood for a moment in the quiet street, the house looming behind them. I've ruined you, Rose said, her voice breaking. Everything you were, everything you had. I've destroyed it all. No, William said fiercely, pulling her close. You've saved me, don't you understand? I was drowning in a life that wasn't mine. You threw me a rope. Tonight, I finally grabbed it. But your mother, the business, society, will recover or they won't, William interrupted. I don't care anymore. The only thing I care about is this. He gestured between them. Us. Whatever comes after tonight, we face it together. You'll regret this, Rose whispered. The only thing I'd regret, William said, kissing her forehead, is not being brave enough to choose you. The newspapers the next morning were brutal and gleeful in equal measure. Duke's shocking romance with servant. Ashworth's fall from grace. Madness or love. Duke courts his scullery maid. Cartoons depicted Rose as a scheming gold digger and William as a fool led astray by base desires. The board of directors of Ashworth Shipping called an emergency meeting. 8 men, all family members or major investors, all horrified by the scandal that was affecting their business reputation. William sat at the head of the table and listened calmly as they made their case. The scandal was damaging stock prices. Business partners were uncomfortable. Investors were threatening to withdraw. The family name was being dragged through mud. His uncle, serving as chairman, delivered the ultimatum. End this relationship immediately. Marry someone appropriate, or we'll vote you out as managing director. The vote, when it came, was 7-1 against him. Only his brother-in-law, married to his supportive younger sister Charlotte, voted in William's favour. The rest stripped him of his position effective immediately, appointing his cousin as replacement. William stood and looked each man in the eye. Gentlemen, I understand your decision, and I accept it without rancour. Managing this company was never truly my choice. It was an inheritance I accepted out of duty. Perhaps it's time someone who actually wants the position should have it. You're throwing away your legacy for a scullery maid, his uncle said with disgust. No, William replied. I'm choosing my own legacy instead of living one I inherited. There's a difference. He walked out of that boardroom, feeling lighter than he had in 15 years. Rose's experience was equally tumultuous, but more painful in some way. She had left Ashworth House the morning after the opera, unable to continue working there given the scandal. Some of the servants supported her, Annie in particular, but others were resentful, accusing her of social climbing and betrayal of her class. You think you're better than us now, one housemaid spat at her. Going after a duke while the rest of us know our place. I never thought I was better than anyone, Rose said quietly. I fell in love. Is that so wrong? William installed Rose in a small but respectable boarding house with a proper chaperone, paying for it despite her protests that she couldn't accept his money. You can't work for me while I'm courting you, he argued, and you can't work anywhere else because everyone knows who you are now. Please, let me help until we figure out what comes next. Rose reluctantly agreed, though it made her deeply uncomfortable to be financially dependent. She spent her days feeling adrift, no longer a servant, but not yet anything else, caught in a limbo between two worlds. The social exile was complete and devastating. Former employers who might have hired her wouldn't touch her now. Society matrons who had barely acknowledged her existence before now went out of their way to snub her publicly. Even her own community was divided, some supportive, others viewing her as a traitor who'd abandoned her class. William's sister Charlotte was a bright spot. She appeared at Rose's boarding house one afternoon, sweeping in with the kind of energy that brooked no argument. Finally, Charlotte said, embracing Rose warmly. Someone real for my brother. Thank God. I was beginning to think he'd end up with one of those vapid society girls who only wanted his credit accounts. Or Charlotte became a regular visitor, bringing books and conversation and badly needed support. Through Charlotte, Rose learned that their mother was slowly coming around, though Margaret's pride was still wounded. She'll accept it eventually, Charlotte assured her. Mother's practical, if nothing else. Once she sees that William is genuinely happy and you're not going anywhere, she'll adjust. It may take months, but she will. 6 months passed. William took a position teaching classical history at King's College London, finally pursuing the dream he'd suppressed for decades. His students loved him. His colleagues respected his scholarship. For the first time in his adult life, he was doing work that fed his soul, rather than just maintaining an inheritance. Rose, with careful saving of the small allowance William insisted she take, began planning her bakery. She found a tiny shop space near the college, took out a small bank loan that William secretly co-signed without her knowledge, and threw herself into creating the business she'd dreamed of for years. They courted properly during this time, no longer hiding but not yet married, navigating the scandal with dignity and patience. William would visit Rose's boarding house with a proper chaperone. They would walk in parks together, attend modest theatre performances, have Sunday dinners at Charlotte's home. Rose met William's family such as it was. His mother remained frosty, but no longer actively hostile. Charlotte was wholly supportive, and slowly, as society saw that this wasn't a brief fling, but a genuine relationship. Some of the censure began to ease. Rose also introduced William to her mother and brother. The meeting took place in the cramped flat where Elizabeth Bennett lived, and William was more nervous than Rose had ever seen him. "What if they don't like me?" he'd asked, almost comically anxious for a duke. "They'll like you if you're genuine," Rose had replied. "Just be William, not the Duke of Ashworth." Elizabeth Bennet had been suspicious at first, examining William with the sharp eye of a mother protecting her daughter. "Why would a duke want my Rose?" she'd asked bluntly. "What's in this for you?" "Everything," William had answered with simple honesty. "Your daughter makes me want to be a better man. She's shown me what it means to live authentically. I love her with everything I am." Something in his face had convinced Elizabeth. She'd reached across and patted his hand. "Then you take care of her, young man. She deserves someone who sees her worth." Thomas, Rose's brother, had liked William immediately. They'd discussed carpentry and classics and life, and by the end of the evening, William felt more at home in that cramped flat than he'd ever felt in Ashworth House. Bennett's Bakery opened in November 1885, a tiny shop that smelled of cinnamon and hope. Rose worked brutal hours getting it established, waking before dawn to start the ovens, working late into the night perfecting recipes. William often helped in the mornings before his classes, and the sight of a duke in a flour-dusted apron serving coffee became a local curiosity that drew customers. The bakery succeeded beyond Rose's wildest dreams. Word spread about the quality of her pastries, the warmth of her service, the reasonable prices. She employed 2 young women from working-class backgrounds, paying them fair wages and treating them with the dignity she'd wished for during her own years in service. One evening in December, as the first snow fell on London, William came to the bakery after closing. Rose was cleaning up, her hair escaping its pins and her apron dusted with flour. She looked up when the bell chimed and smiled, the expression transforming her tired face into something radiant. "You're early," she said. "I'm not quite done here." "I couldn't wait," William admitted. He'd been rehearsing this moment for weeks, and now that it was here, his carefully planned speech evaporated. He crossed the shop and took her flour-dusted hands in his. "Rose Bennett, 8 months ago, I saw you crying on a park bench, and it changed my life. You showed me what I'd been missing by never truly looking at the people around. You taught me what it means to live authentically. You made me braver than I knew I could be." Rose's breath caught. "William, let me finish," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I lost a business I never wanted. I gained a life I never knew I needed. I'm a better man because of you, a happier man, a real man. Finally, after 40 years of going through the motions." He knelt then, there on the flour-dusted bakery floor, and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a sapphire ring, simple and beautiful, her birthstone. "Marry me," he said. "Not because I'm a duke or you were my servant. Just William asking Rose, will you marry me?" Rose was crying now, happy tears that streamed down her face unchecked. "Yes," she managed through her sobs. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." William stood and pulled her into his arms, and they kissed in that small bakery while snow fell outside, and the world went on around them, oblivious to this moment that meant everything to 2 people who had found each other across an impossible divide. The wedding was small, held in February 1886 at St. Mary's Church in Bloomsbury. Fewer than 50 guests attended, Rose's mother and Thomas in the front row, their faces shining with pride and happiness. Charlotte and her family are present and supportive, William's teaching colleagues and some of Rose's bakery customers representing the new life they'd built together. And in the back row, sitting stiffly but present nonetheless, was the Dowager Duchess, Margaret. Her attendance was Charlotte's doing. Weeks of patient persuasion had finally broken through their mother's pride. After the ceremony, Margaret approached Rose with an expression that might almost have been contrite. "I owe you an apology, my dear," she said quietly. "I judged you without knowing you. I saw only what you lacked, instead of what you possessed. You've made my son happier than I've ever seen him. That matters more than any title or fortune ever could." Rose felt tears spring to her eyes. "Thank you. That means more than you know." "May I visit your bakery sometime?" Margaret asked hesitantly. "I've heard it's quite successful. I'd like that very much, Your Grace." At the small reception held in the bakery itself, Charlotte raised her glass in a toast to my brother, who finally had the courage to choose his own life, and to Rose, who showed him what life could be. May we all be brave enough to see what's right in front of us, even when society tells us to look away. 2 years later, in the spring of 1888, William and Rose had built a life that bore no resemblance to either of their previous existences. Bennett's bakery had expanded to 2 locations and employed 6 women, all from working-class backgrounds, all paid fair wages and treated with respect. Rose's success had proven that a working-class woman could build something valuable, could create beauty and prosperity through honest labor and skill. William had published a well-received book on classical philosophy and was considered one of the most popular lecturers at King's College. He'd established a scholarship program for working-class students, using his remaining wealth to help others access the education that could transform their lives the way it had transformed his understanding of the world. They lived in a modest house in Bloomsbury, not the grand estate William had grown up in, but a real home filled with warmth and books and the smell of baking bread. They employed only essential staff, a cook and 2 housemaids, all treated with dignity and fair wages. Rose was pregnant with their first child, and William was nervous and excited in equal measure. On a warm spring evening, they sat together in their small garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Do you ever regret it?" Rose asked, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "The scandal, the struggle, everything you lost." William pulled her closer. "I regret nothing. Every difficulty was worth it to have this, to have you, to have a life that's actually mine, instead of one I inherited." "I love you," Rose said simply. "I love you more," William replied. "You changed my life, Rose." "No," Rose corrected gently. "We changed each other's lives. I was invisible until you finally saw me, and you were imprisoned until I helped you see another way." William kissed her forehead, his hand joining hers on her belly where their child grew. "We proved them all wrong. We proved that love matters more than status," Rose agreed. "That seeing someone truly is worth more than all the blind acceptance in the world. We proved that sometimes the most precious things are the ones we've overlooked," William added softly. "That sometimes you walk past treasure every day for years without seeing it, until the moment you finally open your eyes." The Duke who had finally learned to see, the Maid who had always been worthy of being seen. Together they had built something real from impossible circumstances, from borrowed gloves and public shame to genuine love and hard-won respect. They had proven that class couldn't stop love when it was real. That courage to choose your own path mattered more than following expectations. That sometimes being publicly shamed for being poor leads to exactly the life you were always meant to live. And in a small bakery in Bloomsbury that smelled of cinnamon and hope, their story continued to inspire others to believe that the most profound connections often come from the most unexpected places, and that being truly seen by another person is worth more than all the wealth and status in the world.